History of the fixed blade, truth, error, lies, and terror, Columbus, Tesla, drones, and ancient wisdom lost or hoarded. Are we, quote, insane for questioning the official, conventional wisdom? Are we crazy for questioning what we were taught in school? When we see contradictions in the conventionally accepted version of our world purported by authority figures such as NASA, we're trained or programmed to disregard common sense observations, which essentially bypasses a critical debate which absolutely needs to be had by all rational people. There are a great deal of misunderstandings that need to be scrutinized and explored by modern science, but thanks to manipulative entities such as NASA, crucial facts, for example, the world possessing exactly zero curvature, even from 40 miles into the air as observed by a weather balloon, such critical facts are overlooked, and the misunderstandings, such as the masts of ships appearing before the ship's hull over the horizon, this type of misunderstanding is assumed to be proof of the world as a globe, and is programmed into the minds of each and every person paying any degree of attention to the assertions of modern-aged hypothetical surrealists, also known as theoretical physicists. I think the phrase hypothetical surrealist sums their profession up much more aptly. The official story claims that Columbus was trying to bypass the known trade routes in order to avoid the costs and risks associated with braving such passages to the Eastern world. It's claimed that Columbus was under the impression that the Earth was a ball. However, for some reason he disagreed with Eratosthenes' value of the circumference. I find it fascinating that Columbus would have disagreed with the conventional wisdom surrounding the spherical Earth of his day and staked his life and reputation on this assumption. I find it far more plausible that Columbus was aware of a lost knowledge, or gnosis, involving the American continents. Either that, or he used his total misunderstandings of perspective to base his calculations to estimate the size of the sphere. That would actually make a lot of sense, as a globe world with ships that sank beneath the bend of the curve in just tens of miles would be a tiny little ball indeed. Now, wouldn't it? In other words, Columbus was a dumbass who thought the world was not only a ball, but a much smaller ball than was estimated by Eratosthenes. It's rather obvious that Columbus was misinterpreting his misunderstandings to base his figures, something we've all been guilty of during the course of our lives at some point. But instead of admitting an error in calculations, they'll just state that Columbus accidentally discovered America instead. History claims that Columbus believed the known distance from Spain to Japan, going east from Spain, of course, but he believed that distance represented a greater fraction of the Earth's so-called circumference than it actually represented. So the conventional narrative claims that he found the American continents by mistake when he was trying to find the eastern coast of the Orient, or specifically the islands of Japan, for reference in all of these examples that we're looking at. This mistake must assume that Columbus was completely ignorant or willfully disregarded Eratosthenes' value of the distance around the equator. The only reason I can imagine he would do so was by estimating the Earth's curvature based on observations of distant ships, whose hulls will appear over the horizon after the masts due to the natural laws of perspective, and not because we live on a ball whatsoever. At any rate, if you study the three locations, again, the Canary Islands as the starting point, Japan as the goal destination, and the Bahamas is where he actually ended up, one thing you'll notice is that all three of the locations are indeed in the northern hemisphere, which makes a lot of sense when you realize that we do live on a flat stationary plane with the magnetic north in the very center. It is a logical misunderstanding, or rationally viable yet false conclusion rather, to assume the Earth is a sphere due to the magnetic anomaly emanating from the North Pole, attracting compass needles to that direction. If you look at the Gleason's standard map, which shows the world as a plane as opposed to a sphere, with all the oceans and continents surrounded by what you would call Antarctica, mariners throughout the ages have circumnavigated the world in an east to west or west to east fashion, and always strive to adhere to the northern hemisphere or inner portion of the map whenever possible. This is clearly necessary once you understand the truth, as the northern hemisphere is simply the area of the world that is closest to the magnetic center or North Pole, and therefore is the inner or northern area is much easier to circumnavigate than the outermost or southernmost regions, and for obvious reasons. Mariners during the late 1800s were confounded as to why they ran into major difficulties when attempting to circumnavigate the southern hemisphere of the globe, which we now understand as the outermost region of the flat Earth. In any case, it's impossible to circumnavigate the southern region or outer region in a similar fashion to the northern hemisphere simply because of the vast distances involved. If we lived on a globe, then the southern hemisphere would be exactly as easy to circumnavigate as the northern. Once you realize the truth, the sheer distances involved with circumnavigating the southern or outer region of the map are astonishing, as the lines of longitude apparently do not converge back into a point at the bottom of a sphere, making circumnavigation of the southern region far longer a journey in far more treacherous, vast seas. This misunderstanding renders it impossible for one to circumnavigate the southernmost regions, which are, for all intents and purposes, vastly larger than all the continents combined, as they are mainly oriented towards the center of the map. Now, I'm not claiming the Gleason's map to be 100% accurate, however, it provides a fairly reasonable depiction of the flat Earth, and it would seem the areas south of the equator need a lot further coordinated scrutiny, and of course, circumnavigation of the Antarctic will only be accomplished by free people if we can get the Antarctic Treaty abolished. Of course, when you consider the Gleason's map and the Earth being a stationary plane in general, it becomes obvious why hasn't anyone circumnavigated the so-called globe going south to north. The reason is, of course, circumnavigation only works going east to west, as those two cardinal directions are merely right angles to north and south, so traveling south to circumnavigate the world will always land you in Antarctica, or on the outer edge where you'll need to turn back or die trying to make your way around of it. This is exactly why the Antarctic Treaty was set up, in my humble opinion, because mariners during the late 1800s were essentially demanding a full geodetic survey of the southernmost regions due to a history of lost lives and property resulting from attempting such southern excursions. Apparently, the southern longitudinal lines don't converge back into a point at the bottom of the globe. A geodetic survey would very quickly reveal this fact, therefore Antarctica is now off limits for any sort of free surveying, exploration, or an overall geodetic analysis of the southernmost region of the world as a whole. Sure, we could sign up for a guided tour of what we are told is the South Pole, However, if you were to attempt a major excursion to the northernmost or central or southernmost or outer areas of the world, for some reasons the powers that ought not be would like us to remain in the center of the map. If you look at Jarl Andahoy, he was turned away from trying to go to the northern area, which is the center, as well as excursions to the southern area. He was basically stopped and turned around by military forces. So it's apparently easier to keep us under control physically and mentally if we don't stray too far towards the edges. It's interesting to note the same breed of royalty who commissioned or financed Columbus to circumvent the known trade routes also commissioned Magellan a few decades later, who is credited as being amongst the first men to circumnavigate the world, starting in Spain, heading west and winding up back in Spain. You'll note that Magellan's voyages indeed traveled into the southern hemisphere, however, only when necessary, and in order to make this trick or circumnavigation possible, you really must adhere to the central area or northern hemisphere as much as possible, as the distance around the outside edge or the southern hemisphere is far larger than the distance around the central point. You realize the distance around a sphere should be similar in the southern hemisphere, say at the Tropic of Capricorn, and in the northern hemisphere's Cancer should be the same distance round. And the two distances appear to be in great disparity, which seems to be why Magellan would only travel south when necessary, since the Americas were directly in his way, and the Panama Canal had not yet been built. He had to go all the way around the bottom of South America and then headed due north, so as to take advantage of the shortcut, which is always staying as close to the center as possible, and only deviating from the center when absolutely necessary. Skipping gears a bit to Jupiter, if you studied the so-called real animations of Jupiter supposedly taken from man-made probes deep in outer space, they are rather preposterous and wholly unbelievable or incredible. And by incredible, I do not mean fantastic, I mean not credible, as in a lie. Keeping in mind Jupiter is supposedly 365 million miles away at its nearest point to the Earth in their two supposed orbits, which is very rare, so they're not always that close. Pioneer 10 was supposedly the first man-made instrument to purportedly travel to Jupiter and report back all sorts of, quote, facts about its atmosphere and geological makeup back in 1973, according to the mainstream narrative. Now, Pioneer supposedly completed the first mission to the planet Jupiter. After that, Pioneer 10 became the first spacecraft to supposedly achieve so-called escape velocity from the solar system. This space exploration project was conducted by the NASA Ames Research Center in California, and the space probe was manufactured by TRW Inc. Now, TRW Inc. was an American corporation involved in a variety of businesses, mainly aerospace, automotive, and of course, credit reporting. Because we all know how aerospace, automotive, and credit reporting go hand in hand. It seems to me that also TRW was more interested in research and development concerning intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, so I believe that would make them terrorists, according to the United States' current policies.
In the heart of this great city, we saw tragedy arrive on a quiet morning. September the 11th. September the 11th. September the 11th.
September 11th. September 11th. September 11th. September 11th. September 11th. September 11th.
September 11th, September 11th.
September 11th, September 11th.
September 11th. September 11th. September 11th. September 11th.
September 11th, September 11th, September 11th. September 11th, September 11th, September 11th. September 11th, September 11th, 2001.
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam.
Saddam.
Saddam. Saddam. Saddam.
Saddam Hussein.
War and danger.
Continuing danger.
Hour of danger.
Very, very dangerous world.
A grave new threat.
Horrific acts of atrocities.
Murderous regimes.
Dedicating to killing us.
Tyranny and terror.
Slaughtered thousands.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons programs.
The deadliest of weapons.
Terrible weapons. Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons.
poison gas,
torture chambers, mass graves,
Deadly technologies.
radical ideology of hate,
Terror of threats.
terror,
Terror.
terror,
War on terrorism.
war against terrorism,
Global war on terror.
Global terrorism. 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 Global terrorism.
Terrorism.
terrorism,
terrorism, terrorism,
Terrorism. 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 Terrorism.
the evil terrorists, 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 terrorists,
Terrorist, 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 terrorist.
Terrorist.
terrorists,
terrorists, terrorists,
Terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists, terrorists.
TRW ought to be glad they were not around during W's presidency. At any rate, if you look into TRW, it was a corporation started in 1901 and became defunct in 2002. So isn't it interesting that a corporation as amazingly successful as TRW, which built many of NASA's space probes for them, achieved the unimaginably difficult task of designing a space probe capable of traversing the mind-boggling distances, eventually arriving to the planet Jupiter after passing through the asteroid belt over 80 million miles through in just under a year, the total journey in just under 2 years. This little tin can supposedly traversed the asteroid belt after taking off from the Earth about 7 months. Now keep in mind, the asteroid belt was believed to begin about 80 million miles away back in the 1970s. That's what they apparently believed. However, contemporary science has sort of changed its story to assert that the asteroid belt begins about 93 million miles away from Earth. Now, the first glaring problem I see with Pioneer 10 is the timeline. It supposedly traversed the asteroid belt in about 7 months, which equates to traveling 80 to 95 million miles away from the Earth, give or take, and then after that it somehow managed to complete the remainder of the journey from the asteroid belt to Jupiter, or very close to it, as it supposedly got as close as 16 million miles. My question is, once the Pioneer 10 made it past the asteroid belt in 7 months, how could it possibly complete the remainder of the journey anywhere from 180 to 185 million miles, minimum, in about 9 months? By December 4th, 1973, Pioneer 10 supposedly arrived within a range of 82,178 miles of Jupiter. So again, it took 7 months to travel 80 or 90 million miles, but then it got a sudden major boost in acceleration, allowing it to breeze through the remaining 180 to 185 million miles in just 10 months. I honestly can't believe nobody checked NASA on these facts. It's almost as if NASA was lying and leaving clues or breadcrumbs all around that they are lying. Sort of like the serial killer who wants to get caught, but the police are just too stupid to catch him. It took 4.5 months to travel the first 93 million miles. Then it took 7 months to travel the next 93 million miles, so it's at 11.5 months to do half the journey, or over 180 million miles. But then it completes the remainder of the journey in under 9 months. So it got halfway there, traveling through the asteroid belt in 11.5 months, and then completed the remainder of the journey, which would have been more than half of it, in less than 10 months. Makes a lot of sense, right? Okay, so anyway, I honestly can't believe that nobody checked NASA on these facts. Pioneer 10 is a brazen example of how NASA certainly is a pack of illogical, albeit assertive and convincing, liars. It's comical that intelligent, educated, sophisticated people will swear up and down that NASA is doing legitimate science and proudly boast about how many degrees they have in astrophysics and trigonometry, yet are somehow incapable of simple addition and subtraction when it comes to checking NASA's so-called facts. They just gobble up everything NASA says as gospel without even scrutinizing whether their assertions are physically possible. Then, of course, they peer down their noses at people who dare question NASA's assertions, since we don't have the stacks of degrees and citations needed to participate on the level with NASA and their advisory boards. Nor do we have the unlimited budget and resources granted to NASA in increasing stacks of billion-dollar bills every year. All those stacks of degrees and complex mathematics, yet the standard astrophysicist cannot do simple addition and subtraction when it comes to double-checking NASA's facts, or a technological assertions that fall apart under the slightest inkling of scrutiny. I'm really curious to know how Pioneer 10 made it to the asteroid belt, about 80 to 90 million miles away, then through the asteroid belt, which would last about another 90 million miles of the total 365 million miles total minimum. So here's some fun facts about the asteroid belt. Asteroid belt objects are supposedly made of rock and stone. Some are solid objects, while others are orbiting rubble piles. The asteroid belt is alleged to contain billions and billions of asteroids and meteoroids. Some asteroids in the belt are quite large, but most range in size down to meteoroids like pebbles. We know of at least 7,000 asteroids. That's documented. The asteroid belt may contain many objects, but they are spread out over a huge area of space. This has allowed spacecraft to move through this region without hitting anything. We're talking about an area of the so-called solar system that houses billions and billions of high-velocity, unseen and undocumented lumps of rock and metal, ranging in size from a grain of sand up to miles in diameter. This means all of NASA's plans to reaching Jupiter and beyond and beaming back cartoons of light and yogurt was all hinging on the Hail Mary of Hail Marys, just sort of hoping that their billion-dollar tin can wouldn't cross paths with any of the billions and billions of errant asteroids and meteoroids without any preparation or contingency for such events. Isn't it more plausible that NASA simply lied and fed the astronomers lies? When you realize the distances involved with this mission, it becomes plainly obvious that they were lying and had no intention of their craft to traverse the so-called asteroid belt, and therefore they didn't need to prepare for it. This makes the astronomers and physicists of the world who should be questioning NASA and scrutinizing their data, they're like proverbial kids in a candy store looking at the pretty pictures of yogurt and light, Jupiter. But isn't it odd how Jupiter looks and acts exactly like the Earth in terms of texture and motion? As opposed to similar colors, Jupiter and Earth are very similar in many ways, according to the animations and video evidence courtesy of NASA. I honestly cannot believe that NASA used such low-quality images and animations to trick the entire world for decades. Even up until 2015, the American taxpayers should be furious about this and don't let the ruse of NASA supposedly being run privately, steer you away. We shovel NASA tax money like slop to the pigs just to be dazzled with pretty pictures and bogus telemetry. The scientists of the world are so very dazzled and entranced by the spherical Earth and infinite space, they have all forgotten to rationally, skeptically scrutinize the very ground which they walk upon. A Bible verse sums this up very nicely. It's Romans 1:22 through 32, King James Version. So Romans 1:22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanliness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. This is the official story of Pioneer 10. Pioneer 10 was launched on March 3rd, 1972, by an Atlas Centaur expendable vehicle from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Between July 15, 1972 and February 5, 1973, it became the first spacecraft to supposedly traverse the asteroid belt. Now, let's get something straight here. The phrase traverse the asteroid belt is much easier said than done. We're talking about a supposed area of the solar system that begins roughly 180 million miles from the Sun and extends out to roughly 270 million miles from the Sun. Photography of Jupiter supposedly began November 6, 1973, at a range of 25 million kilometers, or about 16 million miles, and a total of about 500 images were transmitted. If you look at the timeline of the NASA lies surrounding Pioneer 10, the timeline is completely out of whack with what you'd expect to see in reality. However, nobody ever questions NASA so long as they deliver the pretty pictures of light and yogurt on time from space. So you've got 0, obviously that's the launch at 0 months, then 4.5 months to begin asteroid belt, 7 months duration of asteroid belt, so a total duration of 11.5 months at this point, where they pop out the other end of the asteroid belt. And then another 8.6 months from the end asteroid belt mark to arrive a mere 16 million miles from Jupiter, when they began snapping pictures and supposedly orbiting Jupiter. Laughing out loud. So, if the agreed upon model of the solar system involves the asteroid belt beginning about 90 million miles out from Earth and ending about 180 million miles out from Earth, then the Pioneer probe should have been at least a bit less than halfway to Jupiter after exiting the asteroid belt. It's impossible for them to have reached the asteroid belt in just 4.5 months and then exit the asteroid belt in another 7 months. According to modern science, it should have taken them about the same amount of time to reach the asteroid belt as it did to traverse through the asteroid belt completely unscathed, with sheer luck as the cornerstone of their so-called plan. Billions of asteroids, high-velocity, uncharted bullets of rock and metal, according to the conventional model. The distances of the area itself is just mind-boggling, as we're talking about roughly 90 million miles of space filled with high-velocity asteroids, and then popping out the other side would equate to traveling 180 million miles, starting from the Earth. However, the Pioneer 10 was able to manage this task in just 11.5 months for takeoff to successfully traversing the asteroid belt. Then, after 11.5 months, they should have been less than halfway to Jupiter minimum, and yet they somehow managed to complete the remaining balance of the mission in only 8.5 months, which doesn't add up whatsoever. The fact that NASA's timeline doesn't stack up with the agreed upon reality, which is obviously totally preposterous, agreed reality that is. Beyond that, the minimum distance to Jupiter would be about 180 million miles to go after traversing the asteroid belt. However, Pioneer 10 somehow managed to traverse the asteroid belt and ostensibly travel beyond less than halfway point to Jupiter in 11.5 months, and then finish the remaining more than half the journey in a mere 8.5 months. Photography of Jupiter supposedly began November 6, 1973 at a range of 25 million kilometers, or 16 million miles, and a total of about 500 images were supposedly transmitted over 360 million miles through space, through the asteroid belt. Now that we know NASA faked the moon landings, it becomes painfully obvious that they faked Mother effing Jupiter too. The closest approach to the planet was supposedly on December 4th, 1973, at a range of 132,252 kilometers, or 82,000 miles. If you could possibly imagine a dumbass tin can traveling over 20,000 miles per hour through 93 million miles full of asteroids, this dumb, unguided, unintelligently controlled tin can somehow came out the other side of the asteroid belt in under a year and still managed to beam back hundreds of images of the planet Jupiter through the asteroid belt that it just traversed through. This is all extremely far-fetched, and it would be much easier for NASA to completely contrive the images and animations than it would be to actually complete this mission, which is obviously bogus. It's also obvious that we cannot travel to the wandering stars, the lights in the sky, so if an entire world full of people is willing to give you literally billions of dollars per year to pretend that you're visiting the wandering stars, I guess I could see NASA doing this sort of fakery long before physically launching a dumbass probe over 90 million miles, then avoiding the asteroids of the asteroid belt for another 90 million miles, only to complete the remainder of the journey far more swiftly than the first half. So, the part I find odd, if not a bit humorous, is the fact that modern science asserts that the asteroid belt is on average about 93 million miles away from the Earth, or about the average distance to the Sun from the Earth, yet this little tin can called Pioneer 10 supposedly went out beyond the asteroid belt safely without any Han Solo to safely weave the thread of incoming asteroids for a period of over 90 million miles.
Fluvial dampers? No! That's not it! Bring me the hydrosphere!
I don't know how we're gonna get out of this one.
Come on, Joey!
Chewie said 271.
What are you doing? You're not actually going into an asteroid field.
They'd be crazy to follow us, wouldn't they?
You don't have to do this to impress me.
Sir, the possibility of successfully navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1.
Never tell me the odds.
Said you want to be around when I made a mistake. This could be it, sweetheart.
I take it back. We're going to get pulverized if we stay out here much longer.
You can argue with that.
Pulverized.
I'm going in closer to one of the big ones.
Closer. Closer.
The Pioneer 10 traversed the asteroid belt in under 7 months, after taking only 4.5 months to get to the beginning of it, which those two time frames should have been just about the same. So let's just say the asteroid belt begins at about 80 million miles, as the astronauts believed back in the 1970s, and ends about 186 million miles away, according to the mainstream accepted heliocentric model. This means there is a minimum of over 93 million miles which the little dumbass probe traveling through high-velocity asteroids with sheer luck as the plan, protocol, and contingency, as well as luck as its guide through the asteroid belt. If you dissect this a bit, this would mean the Pioneer traveled about 7 months, traversing the frickin' asteroid belt without any sort of mishaps or intelligent maneuvering, and exactly zero planning or systems to avoid or deflect the millions of tiny meteoroids it should certainly encounter on its 7-month journey through the asteroid belt. This is totally preposterous. It is this sort of blatant evidence which compels me to disregard everything NASA tells us, because they are known to be completely full of shamrocks and leprechauns. When viewed from Earth, Jupiter can reach an apparent magnitude of 2.94, or I believe that's minus 2.94 in terms of astronomical brightness or magnitude. Apparently bright enough to cast shadows here on Earth, and making it on average the third brightest object in the night sky after the Moon and Venus. With the naked eye, Jupiter appears to be just like any other star, if not brighter than most. If you study its behavior, you'll notice that it does not remain relatively fixed as the other stars tend to do, but rather wanders through the heavens in cycles over long time periods. We can get better images of Jupiter from here on the ground using a telescope. However, we must be careful when assuming what we see through a telescope to be exact or accurate representation of what we're actually viewing. Remember, telescopes use a series of convex lenses, much like your eye, which will distort the light from objects to appear spherical, when in reality the wandering stars such as Jupiter may simply be mysterious sources of light and not necessarily physical spheres with atmospheres. It's easy to understand how philosophers imagined the moon and wandering stars to be physical worlds. Wouldn't that make us a sort of awkward and unique? a giant, bumbling, possibly infinite plain that stretches out beyond the Antarctic and bears the sun, moon, and stars as mere features of its bumbling self. No, I think it's far more comforting to imagine those spheres are planets, and we must live on a sphere planet too, because it would be rather awkward and defiant to the model to assume there is anything significant or special about our world. Mainstream science claims Jupiter to be many orders of magnitude larger than our world. That is a complete impossibility, as Jupiter is a mere feature, rarely seen in our night sky, a mere feature of the world's entertainment output device for astronomers known as the night sky. The Chinese historian of astronomy Zhi Zizong has claimed that Gan Di, a Chinese astronomer, made the discovery of one of Jupiter's moons in 362 BC with the unaided eye. I really don't understand how the naked eye could see through 93 million miles of asteroids along with an additional 270 million miles of space. The notion that Jupiter is over 360 million miles away is preposterous, but in terms of Gan Di, if Zhi Zizong's accounts are accurate, this would predate Galileo's discovery by nearly 2 millennia. In his 2nd century work, the Almagest, the Hellenistic astronomer Claudius Ptolemaeus constructed a geocentric planetary model based on deference and epicycles to explain Jupiter's motion relative to the Earth, giving its orbital period around the Earth as 4,332.38 days, or 11.86 years. In 499, Aryabhata, a mathematician astronomer from the classical age of Indian mathematics and astronomy, also used a geocentric model to estimate Jupiter's period as, again, 3,332.2722 days, very close to what Ptolemy had arrived at. So again, Aryabhata was 4,332.2722 days, or 11.86 years, so it was essentially the same conclusion. In other words, knowledge of Jupiter and its orbital period were well established long before Galileo was a twinkle in Galileo's mom's eye. If you study the supposed real images of Jupiter from space, they are obviously coming from NASA, so should be summarily disregarded, but they're strangely reminiscent of the trippy lava and light shows of the 60s, for example, the Joshua Light Show, which were abstract artistic expressions using essentially trick photography, different types of lighting, liquids, oils, etc., creating an illusory spectacle of trippy globs of color. The so-called real images of Jupiter interestingly display many striking similarities to the techniques in use by contemporaneous artists responsible for the trippy lava and light shows of the 60s, and of course the animations of Earth from space are nearly identical in terms of image quality with Jupiter. The tricks and techniques needed to fake such footage as that of Jupiter from Pioneer 10 were available in the 1970s and could have been used to recreate the supposed animations of Jupiter from the generic, dumbass, tin can satellites that defy all logic and common sense. It would be exactly 365 million times easier to simply fake the footage and assert the lie.
Who you should really be praying for, out-of-work clowns. At 8:40.
And so the infernal parrots of our world, the astrophysicists, echoed NASA's assertions as factual since said assertions came from the apparent figures of authority, so the entire world just gobbled them up as true factual statements, images, and animations, as the entire world tends to do when figures of authority assert something to be true, no matter how unrealistic or completely unfounded or illogical the assertion. The sheer odds of probes such as Pioneer 10 successfully navigating the vast distances to and through the so-called asteroid belt, and the obvious problems with their alleged timeline clearly shows that NASA has been lying their asses off and the majority of the world has definitely fallen for the trick. If you believe a totally stupid, non-intellectually guided, bumbling tin can of a calculator space probe from 1973 somehow managed to traverse about 90 million miles of high-velocity asteroids for a duration of 7 months, yet somehow managed to make it through the other side unscathed, and subsequently beam back images to the Earth nearly 2 years after being launched through 93 million miles of asteroids, an additional 275 million miles of space minimum, then I've got a bridge I'd like to sell you with a special discount. Switching gears again to the firmament misconception. Looking at source etymon line is for etymology. Firmament, from Old French, firmament, or directly from Latin, firmamentum. Firmament, literally a support, a strengthening, from firmus, strong, steadfast, enduring. See firm, adjective. Used in late Latin in the Vulgate to translate Greek stereoma, firm or solid structure, which translated Hebrew rakia, a word used of both the vault of the sky and the floor of the earth in the Old Testament, probably literally means expanse, from rakah, to spread out, but in Syriac meaning to make firm or solid, hence the erroneous translation, related to the firmament or firmamental. If you look at the original text of Genesis describing the creation account, the word firmament as understood in the English tongue and English mind is indeed a misnomer, mistranslation, and overall misunderstanding. It's extremely important to dissect the etymology of these words, especially from biblical scriptures, to understand how the very words were used to describe biblical intentions, and these can be skewed with even honest translation at times, either purposefully or by an individual translator's reckoning. Doesn't necessarily have to be any malign intent. A lot of modern Christians believe the King James Bible to contain the literal Word of God. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that assertion. However, the translation and end result we're stuck with in the King James Bible are certainly not 100% accurate to the original intention of the words carved into biblical dogmatic stone. Proverbially speaking, of course. The word firmament in English naturally implies it as physical, firm, tangible, strong. However, the original intention of the idea behind the firmament was not necessarily intended to describe a physical dome or firm structure in the sky. Instead, the literal translation of the original word rakah or rakia, which means an expanse stretched out across the world. The birds are explained to fly in the firmament, which sort of goes to show it's not intended to be interpreted as a firm physical object, which is sort of an ignorant English misunderstanding of a biblical concept, which has apparently been mistranslated to manipulate a false understanding of the expanse above to be indicative of a solid, firm physical object, which it was never intended to represent. Anyone who states the firmament of the Bible pointing to a literal physical dome in the sky is simply falling for the mistranslation of rakia, or the expanse of the sky, perverting the original intent of the scripture to mean a physical, tangible firmament. If you do your homework on this, it is indeed erroneous translation of the original intent of the Bible to call the expanse separating the heavens and earth anything firm. Now, I'm not claiming to know that there is not a physical firmament or dome in the sky, but what I'm pointing out is that we cannot interpret biblical scripture based on misinformed translations found often in the King James Bible, with especially the firmament being a glaring example of this. Some languages are difficult to translate to other languages. All languages are like this to one degree or another, and specific words in any language are often untranslatable, or there are secondary meanings of the words that are lost in translation, especially when you're talking about multiple translations to different languages. Switching gears to Tesla. Designed in the early 1900s communications towers that would enable everything from something very similar to the internet, GPS, and cellular technology without satellites. His inventions are argued to include the similar ability to transmit electricity wirelessly, but at the very least, all subsequent radio frequency technology can most certainly be accredited to Tesla's original concepts, schematics, and inventions. For all intents and purposes, Tesla was the greatest electrical engineer ever, and arguably one of the greatest geniuses of the last 2,000 years or so. As great as his achievements were, equally great was the threat to such advancements posed to people like J.P. Morgan, and so equally great was their intent and motive to ruin Nikola Tesla and block such technologies from being widely known and used. J.P. Morgan, who was very much intertwined with the Titanic disaster and played a huge role in exactly who perished on that journey in terms of the VIP guest list, which contained the movers and shakers, politicians, industrialists, even the richest families of the world, including the Astors and the Guggenheims. Yes, the very same J.P. Morgan who was intertwined with the Titanic disaster was also played a very huge role in the ruination of Nikola Tesla and the putting on pedestal of Thomas Edison. Yeah, J.P. Morgan was responsible for backing Thomas Edison, who was essentially a total shill of electrical engineering and was given great esteem, fortune, and fame, while Tesla was ruined and discredited by the big boys like J.P. Morgan, who was really just another Rockefeller and Rothschild lackey. They went to great lengths to discredit Tesla, even by falsely and publicly killing an elephant, supposedly using Tesla's alternating current to kill the elephant, when in fact the elephant was killed using Edison's direct current. However, that little fact didn't come out until way later and the damage had already been done. Edison was put on a pedestal, while Tesla was discredited time and time again, with much of his work and years of documents ultimately being destroyed in a very questionable fire. Tesla wanted his inventions and scientific advances to benefit the world for free. People like J.P. Morgan simply couldn't allow that to happen, as they wanted to monetize everything, especially technologies such as electricity and communications. Monetizing these, commodities would have been extremely difficult if Tesla's systems were implemented on a national level. Well, that is until they actually were implemented on a national level many decades later, and arguably or ostensibly under the guise of satellite technology. What a lot of people don't know is that the US government seized Tesla's home and belongings and grabbed what was left of his notes and devices after his death, documented, categorized, and ultimately filtered what was publicly acknowledged based on national security during wartime. It was 1943. The thing is, they treated his belongings as if he were an illegal alien, even though he was indeed a US citizen. So the federal government had access to whatever was left of Tesla's life work seized by the Office of Alien Property, an arm of the federal government, and then relinquished to the world a version of Tesla's work which was, for all intents and purposes, heavily redacted. I submit the entire space program was designed as a way to monetize Tesla-based technologies and ultimately trick the people of the world into believing they needed satellites to achieve ends which could easily be achieved without the use of satellites. This means NASA itself would have been developed as a huge distraction and tool for deception, which certainly isn't contradicted by the allegations of landing on the moon being extremely suspect, if not downright totally disproved at this point. So they killed two huge birds with one proverbial stone. They set up the groundwork to monetize Tesla's inventions using deception and simultaneously set up a huge distraction and money pit for the citizens and scientists of the world to dump tons of time, greenbacks, and energy into a program that is, for all intents and purposes, the groundwork of our own self-imprisonment, psychologically speaking, of course. Furthermore, I know for a fact that the US military was using so-called geostationary weather balloons during and after World War II, as my grandfather told me all his war stories many times, and indeed told me about how much fun they had using giant weather balloons.
Today, the latest weapons, coupled with the fighting skill of the American soldier, stand ready, on the alert all over the world to defend this country, you, the American people, against aggression. This is The Big Picture, an official television report.
Behind barbed wire, protected by maximum security precautions, the Evans Lab, which is a subdivision of the U.S. Army Signal Engineering Laboratories in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, is the site of many scientific projects. Of 500 scientists working here, many are in the meteorology department. One of the Army's largest research centers, the Evans Lab, provides the multi-million-dollar plant, the elaborate equipment which is required for the meteorology program. Side by side, in radar, radio, thermionics, and communications, scientific teams are working in support of the Army. Because the weather is big, it frequently requires big equipment. The international competition for knowledge.
The U.S. military was using so-called geostationary weather balloons during and after World War II, as my grandfather told me all his war stories many times, and indeed told me about how much fun they had using giant weather balloons, ostensibly for spying purposes, or possibly to bounce communication signals, as the reflective nature of our atmosphere over great distances appears to be a hindrance for long-range radio frequency waves, but not the curve of the Earth, you see, and for fairly obvious reasons. These weather balloons could, coupled with Tesla's ground-based technologies, could be sufficient to create the illusion of satellites and early Google Map technology in terms of imagery and telemetry. I submit that the leaps and bounds made by Google Earth image quality or high-resolution satellite pics for the maps in recent years has more to do with the advancement in drone technology than it does with satellite technology whatsoever. Again, satellites are completely useless when you consider geostationary weather balloons have been in use for at least 60 to 70 years, as well as the technologies developed by Tesla to wirelessly send and receive data over long distances. NASA should mean to all of us, never a serious assertion. I have personally seen, along with another observer, a drone of sorts in flight that appeared to be not a plane whatsoever. It flew very silently, perfectly straight, looked like a tube with solar panels coming off the sides, no lights whatsoever, which could hypothetically take a stream of high-definition images of the ground below very easily. Such images would appear exactly like the images and footage we can view of known drone flights, which are capable of flying completely silently, hovering in place, and do not need the loud, heavy engines used to lift, dense payloads such as people. Unmanned drones fly completely silently due to the fact that heavy people and control schemes and life-supporting systems are not necessary, and footage from known unmanned drones look very similar to images found on Google Maps. It's far more plausible that the images seen on modern online maps are coming from typical airplanes or unmanned drones, and are certainly not coming from satellites hundreds or even thousands of miles away that are somehow able to map the ground in broad daylight when our atmosphere becomes completely reflective in sunlight. A casual observer would agree that we cannot see the stars at night due to the reflective nature of our atmosphere. A similar phenomenon applies when snapping pics of the Earth from high altitudes, or from space no less, and the atmosphere is completely reflective during the daytime, especially at those distances where the orbiting satellite is somehow able to zoom in on a gnat's ass through all that reflective atmosphere, but it's somehow incapable of taking a modern snapshot or steady sweeping video of the Earth from space. Yeah, right, NASA. Those other 5 billion clowns might buy this crap, but I'm certainly asking for my money back. I'll settle for just $1 single billion. I'm pretty easy to please. I don't need $16 billion a year, just $1 single billion. And I guarantee I can make more convincing videos of Jupiter for my $250 million layer. Satellites and dishes go sort of hand in hand, but the notion that the little plastic dish you have stuck to the side of your house is communicating with a geostationary satellite is totally preposterous, and there is no evidence to support nor reason to believe that is what's actually occurring. That generic plastic little dish could just as easily be pointed towards a geostationary balloon similar to the brand spanking new concept of Google Loon, or even more simply and likely tapping into a Tesla technology-based, ground-based system using a series of towers, much like cell phone towers, to deliver the RF waves or microwaves depending on the source you use to research satellite dish technology, but whatever sort of signal picked up by the El Cheapo, uber generic ass plastic dish, whether it's RF waves or microwaves, certainly doesn't necessitate the use of satellites zipping around the thermosphere to achieve that end. The end result, which amounts to a network of devices which plop out hundreds of millions of mindless drones who think they understand science and nature based on their experiencing sounds and images beamed in their brain directly from the manipulative corporations who depend upon the status quo to continue their existence. Most people don't know this, but the idea of a corporation was originally intended to achieve some civic goal or another, and the corporation was never intended to be a perpetual tap of wealth and energy directly from the minds and bodies of the population, ever fattening the wallets of the select few sitting comfortably at the helm of the corporation. That's not what they were intended to do. The fact that the US government, and by extension the US military, has had access to Tesla's deliberately hidden technology since as early as 1943 proves that the notion of the military launching satellites up 10 years and even 60 years later to accomplish what can be achieved using balloons, for God's sake, balloons and ground-based technology we've had for over 70 years, this all makes the idea of using satellites completely preposterous, even if we lived on a sphere, which we obviously do not. If you couple all this with a rocket ship's inherent need for back pressure or resistance towards the nose of the rocket caused by pressure at high speeds, the air pressure needed to keep a rocket stable in flight here on Earth would not exist in space, and so any rocket-propelled craft in the theoretical vacuum of space would simply be uncontrollable, which is why I submit they always launch vertical, of course, but curve their trajectory more or less horizontal, and sometimes curve beyond the horizontal, meaning they are headed straight back down after the peak of their ascent. Since rockets appear to have a maximum altitude based on the laws of aerodynamics, it's safe to assert that once you reach a certain altitude above the ground, the barometric pressure needed to fly a rocket would simply not exist. Therefore, rockets cannot fly above a certain point without becoming uncontrollable spinning bombs, which are certainly not much use in terms of gathering data. Agreed? So, we've all seen how Google Earth allows you to zoom in pretty darn close to the ground. The distance you can zoom in has increased over the past 10 or so years if you've been paying attention. I've seen what appeared to be a rather large drone flying pretty high up on a totally clear day, completely silently, completely straight, and was not a plane. Such a drone would be perfect for Google to use for their mapping, and I believe that's exactly what it was. The short strips of data, often attributed to satellite footage for some reason, is so very unbelievable, as the strips should be hundreds or even thousands of miles wide strips at those distances, and drones or even commercial jetliners could easily take digital images of the ground to later be compiled into maps wrapped around a sphere for the ultimate spectacle of Google Earth. If you study the modern digital online maps of so-called satellite technology, you'll find evidence of the world being a plane as opposed to a sphere, which equates to evidence of most people being literal prisoners of a theoretical device. Drone flybys and even stationary balloons seem to explain the end results of what has been accredited to satellite technology, much more logically and completely in the former. I don't understand how, if the Earth is a globe and satellites are taking those pictures, which can apparently zoom into a gnat's rear from hundreds or even thousands of miles away, how can A, the satellite see the ground during the daytime at all due to the reflective nature of the atmosphere? B, how can the satellite see the ground so clearly during the day, even on a clear day? And why is Google just now planning to use weather balloons when the military has been using them since as early as the 1940s or even earlier for the same exact purpose? During the day, the sky turns blue or lights up blue like a sapphire because of the yellow sun, and therefore we cannot see space. If this is the case, then how can a satellite in space see the ground? It's plainly obvious that the atmosphere should be completely reflective from such distances during the daytime, much like the atmosphere becomes reflective near the horizon or vanishing point here on the ground in the daytime. In other words, at specific distances within the atmosphere becomes reflective, especially during the day. The atmosphere is totally reflective in terms of observing space during the day here on Earth, and is conversely totally transparent during the night, apparently here on Earth, even during a full moon. I think it's an interesting, aside from its other documented properties, but moonlight does not cause the atmosphere to be reflective whatsoever. In any case, the atmosphere appears to be blue and reflective at relatively close distances here on Earth, but only during the day. Shouldn't the atmosphere be similar from geostationary satellite distances? And what types of technology do the satellites supposedly use to counter this attribute of atmosphere rendered as completely reflective by sunlight? Infrared just doesn't cut it. As we can clearly see, the images from Google Earth appear to be taken only a few miles into the air and are not snapped hundreds or thousands of miles above the atmosphere in the thermosphere. That is a ridiculous assertion. The only logical conclusion I can draw is that the military has been using Tesla-based technologies, geostationary balloons, and a great deal of secretive deception to build a matrix of reality that is believed by most people in the world, but is very far removed from reality itself. They have been taking advantage of practical uses of Tesla technologies and created the cultural situation where Tesla technologies are used to aid us in our own self-imprisonment psychologically. Trying to understand solar eclipses and their relationship to lunar cycles is critical. As far as I can tell, solar eclipses lend credence to the lunar cycles being a direct relation to the relative position of the moon and sun to the observer here on Earth. Full solar eclipses occur only during a no moon or new moon phase. Important note, during May, June, and July, the northern hemisphere is exposed to more sunlight. The same is true of the southern hemisphere in November, December, and January. Due to seasonal lag, June, July, and August are the hottest months in the northern hemisphere, and December, January, and February are the hottest months in the southern hemisphere. Seasonal lag attributed to where the sun was last month in terms of the position in the sky at high noon. In other words, the hottest months stray behind the sun's highest path in the sky by an entire month. So even though May technically should begin summer in solar terms, instead the month of May is the end of spring and summer starts the following month, or very near the end of May. If you can see the distinction between high summer in terms of solar cycles and high summer in terms of warmer days here on the Earth, there is essentially a 1 month lag between the two, with apparent summer, or the hottest months we experience here on the ground, trailing behind the solar high summer by about a month. So instead of using the latter, I will use the former, which is essentially sliding the seasons back a month to be more in line with the solar activity as opposed to the lagged out by a full month apparent seasons in the northern hemisphere. So instead of winter equals December, January, February, then winter equals November, December, January. So instead of spring being March, April, or May, spring would be February, March, and April. If you see the pattern, we just slid the seasons back a month. So, using the chart on the next page, fully realizing that the conventional model asserts that the sun is approximately 400 times larger and further than the moon on average, and also acknowledging that the seasons are supposedly caused by the Earth's tilt, I'm interested in the relationship between the seasons and the Earth's supposed elliptical orbit, and that relationship to full and annular solar eclipses. You would expect the annular solar eclipses and total solar eclipses to have some relationship to the Earth's supposedly elliptical orbit, since the distance to the Sun and orbital speed of the Earth are supposedly affected by this so-called factor, or the ellipse of the orbit. It seems odd to me that the total and annular eclipses documented over the course of about 15 years, starting in 1900, just to take a sample, appear to cycle in type and season, or code, very quickly. The difference between annular and total eclipses is important here. So an annular eclipse refers to the moon being apparently slightly smaller than the sun, but perfectly eclipses the sun at the centers and creates the perfect ring of sun surrounding the outer edge of the moon. During a total eclipse, of course, the moon is exactly the size of the sun at least, and completely covers the sun for some duration. I must say the odds of such an alignment, total or annular, would seem to me, using the conventional model, extremely rare. However, there were over 200 solar eclipses during the 1900s alone, including partial and hybrid eclipses. It was 228. So we'll just take a look at this chart right here, and if you want to pause it here or whatever, you can take a look at it. But and this is a fairly well-known cycle that the eclipses go through, and I was just curious, first off, to see the relationship of the phases of the moon with solar eclipses, which it's pretty obvious that all solar eclipses occur during a new moon, which to me does lend some type of credence to the phases of the moon being a direct relation to the relative position of the moon and the sun and us here on the Earth, the observer. There is evidence to the contrary, but I just found that sort of interesting. Now, one thing that I found extremely interesting were these codes, which I was just basically looking at the season, the type of eclipse. Again, this chart was only total and annular, and how those cycles worked. And I was expecting to see the cycles to be very long because of, well, we'll get into some information that I quoted from the U.S. Navy so that hopefully you can understand what I'm saying here and why I'm surprised to see these codes cycle through different seasons having annular and total eclipses, relatively back to back. So I think this data clearly shows that there is indeed evidence of a relationship between the moon's cycle and its relationship to the sun. This relationship has been questioned a lot lately, and I think we can all agree that this data shows that the new moon will always be conditional of at least total and annular eclipses, lending credence to the assertion that the phases of the moon are caused by the moon's relation to the sun and us, the observer. In other words, I don't necessarily believe the moon being self-luminous is in line with the evidence apparent with solar eclipses that we're looking at here. Also, I've seen a lot of videos with the moon appearing to go behind clouds. I believe that would be an optical illusion. The moon is way too far away to actually go, to have clouds go behind it, but it is a neat optical illusion, and I think it does lend some credence to the moon and the sun not being entirely what they seem, or at least the light from the moon not being 100% representative of what it is. The part of this data that I find really interesting is found in the code section, or more specifically, the duration which it takes for, say, the summer to produce a total eclipse versus summer producing an annular eclipse. Where I was expecting to see a very long duration, you can see that during the first eclipse on the chart, May 18th, 1901, is a summer total eclipse, or in code, just ST, summer total. However, the ninth on the chart is an SA, or summer annular, in 1907, and then we find in June of 1908 a summer annular, and then in May of 1910 a summer total. So the cycle between SA, or summer annular, and ST, or summer total, eclipse is a really fast cycle and goes from SA to ST back to SA in under 10 years. The reason I find this so interesting has to do with the relationship between seasons and the Earth's so-called elliptical orbit. During the 1900s, winters were supposedly more mild due to this factor of the Earth's elliptical orbit, and I'll quote the U.S. Navy here to hopefully give you the best definition. Okay, so the Earth reaches its perihelion, the point in its orbit closest to the Sun, in nearly January, only about 2 weeks after the December solstice. Thus, winter begins in the northern hemisphere at about the same time that the Earth is nearest the Sun. Is this important? Is there a reason why the times of solstice and perihelion are so close? It turns out that the proximity of the two dates is a coincidence of the particular century we live in. The date of perihelion does not remain fixed, but over very long periods of time slowly regresses or moves later within the year. There is some evidence that this long-term change in the date of perihelion influences the Earth's climate. End quote. So I find this very interesting, especially if you consider how unlikely a total or annular solar eclipse should be in the conventional globe Earth model. We're talking about the moon, a relative speck of dust compared with the sun, which is supposedly 93 million miles away, with the moon being 400 times closer, somehow managing to travel directly between the distant sun and perfectly traverse the sun exactly across its center. Seen from any vantage point on planet Earth would be extremely unlikely in terms of random scenarios. I'm really quite astonished to find 228 solar eclipses, including hybrid and partials, just in the 20th century alone. What's more, when we study the so-called lunar eclipses, we find that they are roughly equivalent in number to solar eclipses, partials and hybrids included in both counts. And this, to me, is extremely damning to the conventional globe Earth model because a lunar eclipse should be far more likely than a solar eclipse, and for a few reasons. The moon would need to, for a solar eclipse, the moon would need to thread the proverbial needle and defy all odds by passing directly in front of the sun from the vantage point here on Earth. However, for the moon to travel behind the Earth's shadow would seem extremely likely. It would necessarily occur for some duration during each month, during the moon's supposed orbit around this spherical Earth. If you really consider the big picture, the fact that the lunar eclipses are just as likely as solar eclipses over a 100-year period seems extremely suspect if you take the time to consider the conventional model, which is an exercise in insanity and futility, but we must sometimes stoop to our opponent's level in order to be effective against said opponent. The reason being is you would certainly expect to see lunar eclipses far more frequently than solar eclipses just by their very nature. The fact that lunar eclipses are equally as common or equally as rare, depending on how you look at it, but there was about 230 in 100 years of each, so they're, equally plausible or equally possible to happen. Now, should this tell us something about the nature of our world and the nature of eclipses? Now, the Library of Alexandria in Egypt was created by Ptolemy I Soter around 300 BC. Now, this is not the astronomer Ptolemy. However, this Ptolemy is stated as being either the son of Alexander the Great, or he was 2 years older than Alexander the Great and was his best general. You'd think we'd know this history, but I found conflicting accounts of exactly who this Ptolemy actually was. In any case, Ptolemy the astronomer came afterwards around 100 AD. Now, 200,000 scrolls were supposedly donated by Mark Antony to Cleopatra as a wedding gift, and these would have gone to the Library of Alexandria. The interesting part has to do with the 200,000 scrolls and where they came from. Apparently, the 200,000 scrolls purportedly were gifted to Cleopatra by Mark Antony came from the Library of Pergamum, which just so happens to be one of the 7 cities directly written to by the Apostle John in his letters to the 7 churches in Revelation. In Revelation 2:12, you'll see the Library in Alexandria was set up to preserve history and some type of important knowledge, followed by, of course, the Romans, who besieged and destroyed, or more likely hoarded that knowledge, to ensure humanity remains ignorant of this particular knowledge for whatever reason. Could it be the knowledge stored in Alexandria, Egypt, was similar to knowledge kept by the Mayan cultures? And that is why Rome wanted the knowledge either destroyed or more likely seized by Rome. Make no mistake, Rome didn't change when it became the authority on Christianity. Rome only changed its clothes and its masks, but is most certainly still to this day Rome. You could argue that the Roman practices were derived from the earlier Greek, which were derived from the earlier Egyptian, derived from the earlier Sumerian or Babylonian sun worship, but all very similar in their tenets, dogmas, and doctrine. Now, the original Library of Pergamum, specifically linked to Satan's throne in Revelation 2:12, was moved and reconstructed in Berlin, Germany by Adolf Hitler, where it resides to this day in a museum showcasing the Library of Pergamum dedicated to Apollo, arguably dedicated to Lucifer himself. Apollo, Apollyon, the fallen angel Lucifer. So in Revelation 2:12, when they refer to Satan's throne, this becomes very arguably or obviously a reference to the temple dedicated to Apollo. Funnily enough, Magellan, the same Magellan who was credited with being amongst the first to circumnavigate the globe, Magellan was commissioned by Spanish royalty to circumnavigate the globe, much like Columbus was commissioned by Spanish royalty to ultimately, quote, discover India or America. Keeping in mind that all European royalty, including Spanish royalty during that phase of history, was at least in bed with, if not ultimately beholden to, the Catholic Church of their time, or in other words, beholden to Rome. So this leads to the destruction of the Mayan and South American knowledge. So it was Rome before Christ that purportedly destroyed or hoarded the knowledge, or gnosis, or esoteric hidden knowledge, arguably housed in the Library of Alexandria, Egypt, much of which papers would have come from the Library of Pergamum. It's argued that the big G of Freemasonry involves the Gnostic knowledge, God, geometry, or the grand architect of the universe. The G is obviously only found in English-speaking lodges and was not part of the original symbolism of Freemasons. The big G is argued to stand specifically for gravity, or the gravitational constant, or simply big G, and it makes a lot of sense according to the timeline of Newton's life, death, and the theory of gravity itself being at best incorrect, at worst a deception. Freemasonry picked up the big G, which arguably represents the gravitational constant, a factor that was being popularized around the time of Newton's death, which really makes a lot of sense if we test the hypothesis big G of Freemasonry actually equals the gravitational constant, or the big G of physics, and gravity is one of these secrets of Freemasonry. The secret being that gravity actually doesn't exist. It is a mere construct of their own means to an end. It's important to understand that Freemasonry was not necessarily always about the same rituals and symbolisms that we associate with Freemasonry today. It just so happens that Freemasonry was the perfect medium or matrix for the carriers of the torch, so to speak, or the Luciferians, but it was the perfect medium for them to subvert, co-opt, and ultimately transform into a secretive sun-worshipping cult. Just like all other movements or organizations which are taken over by this cult, will always be transformed into secretive sun-worshipping cults, unbeknownst especially to the initiates or laymen at the bottom degrees. Freemasons were, prior to being subverted by this sun-worship cult, builders and architects who were allowed to travel across borders unchallenged, where anyone else would have been confined to those borders, and so they necessarily developed secret handshakes and secret methods to determine rank, or even simply to determine whether or not the person claiming to have rite of passage was indeed a builder and not just some peasant trying to illegally cross the border. This is why they're called Freemasons. I submit that this was the reason why Freemasonry was originally co-opted by nefarious, well-funded psychopaths and probably sun worshippers. Freemasons were originally strictly builders and architects, but during the late 1700s, they started allowing speculative or accepted Masons, wherein anyone, white and male anyone of course, would become a Freemason or could become a Freemason given certain conditions, such as being invited by a member and then unanimously accepted to the lodge, and only if they believe in some form of higher power or God. No atheists were allowed in Freemasonry at that point. And I believe that's still the case to this day. In the early to mid-1900s, Aleister Crowley is probably responsible for ultimately integrating Freemasonry with magic, Kabbalism, and or Talmud rites, along with other occult, esoteric magic rites and symbols. He would have been very familiar with all of this because he had been a studious and prodigal ritual magician, and was probably very quick to discover, or possibly to insert, or even imagine, or possibly supplant connections between Freemasonry and occultism, but connect those dots he certainly did. One thing which cannot be disputed is that after the Beast, or Crowley, made his mark on Freemasonry, it was from that point forward very close to what it is today, a totally subverted Luciferian, sun-worshipping cult of an organization. Now, either Crowley deciphered things no one else prior to him could decipher, or because he was extremely biased as a ritual magician, as well as extremely anti-Christian, he ultimately merged his own personal belief systems into the practices and symbolism of Freemasonry, arguably adding a great deal to the ultimate deception of their initiates. Many will argue that Freemasonry was subverted long before Crowley, which it very well may have been. Crowley was certainly a key player in unlocking or externalizing the occult and esoteric influence of and upon various arms of Freemasonry. So, with all that being said, the big G in Freemasonry could indeed allude to gravity, or the gravitational constant, as the adoption of big G in English Freemasonry adheres very nicely to the timeline of Newton's theorizing of gravity and his subsequent death in the late 1720s. It would also jive with the major mind flapjack that is heliocentrism, which all boils down to sun worship, a religion practiced by more people than all other religions combined, and the vast majority of people are deceived into worshiping the sun, or Apollo, or Apollyon the Destroyer, or Ra, or even the Shell gas station's logos. The Shell gas station's logo is obviously a reference to this cult of sun worshippers. It seems that Freemasonry, ritually indistinguishable from Satanism and Mormonism in modern terms, has been a breeding ground for psychopaths and a repository for esoteric knowledge, plucked from all sorts of different forms of paganism, ultimately designed as a great deception, attractive to white male people at first, but now Freemasonry sort of opened its doors to women and minorities, but originally it was attractive to white male people who believe in a higher power. Conversely, these esoteric pluckings of knowledge can be used to point fingers at different people in terms of who's to blame or who's behind Freemasonry. Just something to consider. When attempting to circumnavigate the southern hemisphere of the globe, which we now understand as the outermost region of the flat Earth. In any case, it's impossible to circumnavigate the southern region or outer region in a similar fashion to the northern hemisphere simply because of the vast distances involved. If we lived on a globe, then the southern hemisphere would be exactly as easy to circumnavigate as the northern. Once you realize the truth, the sheer distances involved with circumnavigating the southern or outer region of the map are astonishing, as the lines of longitude apparently do not converge back into a point at the bottom of a sphere, making circumnavigation of the southern region far longer a journey in far more treacherous, vast seas. This misunderstanding renders it impossible for one to circumnavigate the southernmost regions, which are, for all intents and purposes, vastly larger than all the continents combined, as they are mainly oriented towards the center of the map. Now, I'm not claiming the Gleason's map to be 100% accurate, however, it provides a fairly reasonable depiction of the flat Earth, and it would seem the areas south of the equator need a lot further coordinated scrutiny, and of course, circumnavigation of the Antarctic will only be accomplished by free people if we can get the Antarctic Treaty abolished. Of course, when you consider the Gleason's map and the Earth being a stationary plane in general, it becomes obvious why hasn't anyone circumnavigated the so-called globe going south to north. The reason is, of course, circumnavigation only works going east to west, as those two cardinal directions are merely right angles to north and south, so traveling south to circumnavigate the world will always land you in Antarctica, or on the outer edge where you'll need to turn back or die trying to make your way around of it. This is exactly why the Antarctic Treaty was set up in my hundreds in all of these examples that we're looking at. This mistake must assume that Columbus was completely ignorant or willfully disregarded Eratosthenes' value of the distance around the equator. The only reason I can imagine he would do so was by estimating the Earth's curvature based on observations of distant ships, whose hulls will appear over the horizon after the masts due to the natural laws of perspective, and not because we live on a ball whatsoever. At any rate, if you study the three locations, again, the Canary Islands is the starting point, Japan as the goal destination, and the Bahamas is where he actually ended up, one thing you'll notice is that all three of the locations are indeed in the northern hemisphere, which makes a lot of sense when you realize that we do live on a flat stationary plane with the magnetic north in the very center. It is a logical misunderstanding, or rationally viable yet false conclusion rather, to assume the Earth is a sphere due to the magnetic anomaly emanating from the North Pole, attracting compass needles to that direction. If you look at the Gleason's standard map, which shows the world as a plane as opposed to a sphere, with all the oceans and continents surrounded by what you would call Antarctica, mariners throughout the ages have circumnavigated the world in an east to west or west to east fashion, and always strive to adhere to the northern hemisphere or inner portion of the map whenever possible. This is clearly necessary once you understand the truth, as the northern hemisphere is simply the area of the world that is closest to the magnetic center or North Pole, and therefore is the inner or northern area is much easier to circumnavigate than the outermost or southernmost regions, and for obvious reasons. Mariners during the late 1800s were confounded as to why they ran into major difficulties. that Columbus was trying to bypass the known trade routes in order to avoid the costs and risks associated with braving such passages to the Eastern world. It's claimed that Columbus was under the impression that the Earth was a ball. However, for some reason he disagreed with Eratosthenes' value of the circumference. I find it fascinating that Columbus would have disagreed with the conventional wisdom surrounding the spherical Earth of his day and staked his life and reputation on this assumption. I find it far more plausible that Columbus was aware of a lost knowledge, or gnosis, involving the American continents. Either that, or he used his total misunderstandings of perspective to base his calculations to estimate the size of the sphere. That would actually make a lot of sense, as a globe world with ships that sank beneath the bend of the curve in just tens of miles would be a tiny little ball indeed. Now, wouldn't it? In other words, Columbus was a dumbass who thought the world was not only a ball, but a much smaller ball than was estimated by Eratosthenes. It's rather obvious that Columbus was misinterpreting his misunderstandings to base his figures, something we've all been guilty of during the course of our lives at some point. But instead of admitting an error in calculations, they'll just state that Columbus accidentally discovered America instead. History claims that Columbus believed the known distance from Spain to Japan going east from Spain, of course, but he believed that distance represented a greater fraction of the Earth's so-called circumference than it actually represented. So the conventional narrative claims that he found the American continents by mistake when he was trying to find the eastern coast of the Orient, or specifically the islands of Japan, for reference. History of the fixed blade, truth, error, lies, and terror, Columbus, Tesla, drones, and ancient wisdom lost or hoarded. Are we, quote, insane for questioning the official conventional wisdom? Are we crazy for questioning what we were taught in school? When we see contradictions in the conventionally accepted version of our world purported by authority figures such as NASA, we're trained or programmed to disregard common sense observations, which essentially bypasses a critical debate which absolutely needs to be had by all rational people. There are a great deal of misunderstandings that need to be scrutinized and explored by modern science, but thanks to manipulative entities such as NASA, crucial facts, for example, the world possessing exactly zero curvature, even from 40 miles into the air as observed by a weather balloon, such critical facts are overlooked, and the misunderstandings, such as the masts of ships appearing before the ship's hull over the horizon, this type of misunderstanding is assumed to be proof of the world as a globe, and is programmed into the minds of each and every person paying any degree of attention to the assertions of modern-aged hypothetical surrealists, also known as theoretical physicists. I think the phrase hypothetical surrealist sums their profession up much more aptly.